We are in the midst of our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga in a larger discussion spanning several chapters, in which Sri Aurobindo has shown the underlying oneness, which is the realization that we seek, but which is also the foundation upon which the divine life has to unfold. But for the purpose of that, we have to understand how reality is to be re-embraced from this underlying oneness. And the first principle that Sri Aurobindo takes up to integrate into this oneness is the duality of Purusha and Prakriti, the observing poise of pure consciousness, and the executive energy that forms this whole world, but also forms our individual being and personal nature. This relationship, we have seen, has multiple facets. He dwelt upon 6 in particular, beginning from the poise where the individual soul seems almost entrapped by nature. It can stand back in a position of an observer, and through successive stages of support and sanction, it can move to the poise of mastery and of enjoyment of nature as its own power of self-expression. In its highest, the poise of the Purusha and the energy of the Prakriti are found to be only aspects of the Sat, Chit, Ananda, the Sat consciousness supporting and the Chit energy pouring out from the Sat, and the two can never be separated. The practical result of this is the entire purpose of our yoga, and even the means of the yoga undergoes a massive shift. No more can we speak of the individual soul's liberation in exclusion from the liberation of the Prakriti and even the divinization and transformation of life. And so this will be the larger movement of the discussion over the next couple of chapters. But in the chapter we are at now, titled The Soul and Its Liberation, Sri Aurobindo takes a pause to consider what is the implication of this relationship of Purusha and Prakriti, and the implications he takes to their deep and most insightful perception. And this is the fascinating passage that we have been reading, of which the last time we kind of made a reasonably detailed summary spanning several pages, but which I will briefly restate, so for the purpose of continuity, but also because this shift in viewpoint is something so essential, so necessary, and at the very foundation of the integral yoga, that it is something to be imprinted and worked upon consciously, and so different from the way things are looked at conventionally. In the first place, in the portion that we saw, the last couple of sessions, Sri Aurobindo points out that the individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind, but it is also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible and the enjoyment of the divine immortality. And he has brought the place of the individual now center stage, but putting in right relation with the larger universal need as well as the divine. And the relationship between these three, he says, is what will help us to understand the otherwise what is an puzzling feature of the world and our place in it. He explains how there is only ultimately one Purusha, but that one Purusha can set up numerous relationships with the universe, with himself, with his own consciousness in the universe. And each of these experiences, standpoints or positions of consciousness that he can experience or he simultaneously experiences are the many individualities that we feel ourselves to be or in which we view everybody else. Now this shift is something so important. We no more see individuals as merely other centers of separate souls or consciousness. We see only one Purusha experiencing himself in so many different ways, and each of these ways is the journey of an individual. But it is still the same one Purusha. Or rather, that which I am in my highest, deepest truth of being is what each one is in their highest and deepest truth of being. Or putting it another way, each one is none other than myself, experiencing the universe differently, exploring his own innate possibilities in a different line of journey, but still the same one, the same Purusha. Just this one shift changes the nature of the game of the universe. While it is possible for an individual to withdraw from the play and lose himself in some immersion of some transcendence or oneness beyond some heavenly realization, it is myself in that particular poise that experiences it. And at the same time, it is myself in this poise which experiences this and not that. And so we begin to view the individual as such an important center because it allows for so many different experiences of the same one Purusha to be experienced at the same time, but also to be able to share between each other for a greater joy and delight of the universe, of the play. And so this is the first important shift that he brings. In this poise, we can take a double position. We can either stand back from the true Purusha that we are, standing aside and fixing ourselves in our individual mind and ego, and then we distance ourselves from our true individuality. Or we can allow ourselves to shift back into the true poise of individuality, freed from limited mind and ego, recovering our true consciousness in the power of self-knowledge. To separate from it and focus on the false identification of the surface separateness is our power of ignorance. To recenter ourselves in the true individual is our power of self-knowledge. But both are possible to us, and a whole range of experiences in between which make for the richness of the play. But that poise of being centered in our true individuality is a consciousness which is spiritual, infinite, and universal. Sri Aurobindo explains how, as we enter that, it is only the sense of separateness and division which begins to fall away. When we live in that, we live in a consciousness in which death does not exist. Yes, there is the taking up of a form, there is the discarding of a form, but we live always in immortality. And it is this poise that the ancients referred to as non-birth. And non-birth is not absorption into some divine consciousness separate from the world. It is living in the consciousness in which we know our immortality even as we experience the full play of the universe not bound by any limitation in the play. Sri Aurobindo then takes up the whole question of this relationship. Yes, there is the experience of death in the most material part of the world and of the cosmos, and here it is possible and it is tempting for many philosophies and religions to declare that true immortality is not possible in the body. For that one has to go into other states and so on, and they use the power of the intellect to justify every position. Sri Aurobindo does not even enter into that argument here for this purpose. He does deal with it separately elsewhere, but here he says all of this really is irrelevant, because what matters is the poise that the Purusha has established itself in relation to nature in each individual. Remember, each individual is bent to follow a line of experience of the Purusha in his self-discovery and self-expression. And so yes, there are certain lines of experience that the Purusha has chosen in which absorption in a beyond is the whole purpose of that journey. For another, it will be the discovery of a different state of consciousness, of a heavenly state, separate from the world, which is his purpose. And in each of these cases, it is the delight of the Purusha to pursue that line of experience, which is the driving force, and the intellect only justifies that experience by utilizing its logic to justify it. There are equally a much larger number of poises of Purusha which engage with life from a liberated consciousness, and so their purpose is not withdrawal from the world. To read the line at the end of that paragraph, our intellectual justifications are only the account of that experience which we give to the reason, and the devices by which we help the mind to ascend to the direction in which the soul is moving. In other words, the joy of the soul has already chosen this line of experience, and the logic of the mind is used to justify it and assist that movement. Now, this is another extremely important idea, because what it shows you is that in each individual's journey, there is the delight of the soul which is the primary driving force. And in their delight of soul's journey, there are particular lines which are the most fulfilling. If you go off that line, the soul feels somehow unfulfilled. Bring it back in line and it feels itself fulfilled and grows. And we recognize each one has their own unique way and unique journey, even as we are all the same one, nourishing and assisting each other. The role of the ego he places now in context. He says that this sense of world and all of us being separate is not caused by the ego's existence. Rather, he says, the ego is the result of the relationship that the Purusha has set up in these different individuals. And he describes it like this. It, the ego sense and separation, it is a relation which the many-souled Purusha has set up between individualized minds and bodies. A relation of self-defense and mutual exclusion and aggression, in order to have among all the dependencies of things in the world upon each other, a possibility of independent mental and physical experience. So it's as if from the beginning, the one Purusha set up this relationship that each individual will as if assert this poise of separation or defense of himself, exclusion from others, and even an aggression to defend, to allow for the maximum possibility of an individualized experience and an independent experience of mind and body. If there was not this, we would tend to blur into each other very easily. Something which we see in certain kinds of collective consciousness in animals, among bees or among certain kinds of fish or ants, where the individual is blurred and pulled into the group consciousness, and sense of the group. But that would not serve the purpose of individuality and independence of experience. Since each one is to follow his own independent line of experience, there is the first setting up of this sense of mutual exclusion, self-defense, even aggression. But the whole point of this is to be able to allow for maximum freedom of each. And yet, being part of the one, not only one nature, but also one Purusha, of which we are all individuals, you can never really separate anything. Everything is deeply interdependent. And so, the attempt to separate yourself and assert your independence, when taken to its maximum, leads to the soul cutting off from the world, cutting off from God, and even denying its own individuality, because to say that I am individual means to put back dependence. And this is the practical result of a path that seeks to separate out and assert its independence. And this is what you see in the self-annihilation of the Buddhist as the absolute exclusion of all that the mind perceives. And he says, the self-immersion of the Advaitin in his absolute being is the self-same aim, differently conceived. Both are a supreme self-assertion of the soul of its exclusive independence of Prakriti, of nature. So in both you will see in the outcome, there is an individual that withdraws and immerses. In the Buddhist annihilation, there is the dissolution as if of all sense of nature, of God, of individuality. In the Advaitin, there is the immersion of the individual merging into God, in which even nature is as if dissolved, all blurred out into a single one divinity. But both are really differently conceived, he says. Now the suggestion here is both poises come from the position that the mind has taken in this world experience. Even he uses this word, the absolute exclusion of all that the mental being perceives. You will see therefore in both these paths a very great importance given to the mind, first to disengage itself from the senses and then to dissolve the mind. Because the experience itself is entered through the mind's perception of reality. And this, he says, becomes very easy, especially when one has taken the shortcut to liberation by a movement of withdrawal from the world to be able to enter into higher states of consciousness. And he explains now what happens, the role of the mind in this. When we are meeting each other, how do we know what is being experienced by the other? I meet you, I meet my dog, I meet the worm, I meet a stone. How do I know what's happening within each of them? I don't. But because I see you as being human with hands, speaking similar language, behaving the same way, I assume you have similar thoughts as I have, you have similar feelings as I have, and if I feel something deeper within me as a soul or a divine presence, well, you too might be feeling that. But when I meet the dog, the difference of form is so much, I'm not too sure. Yes, he does have some feelings and thoughts, but how far does it go? When I meet the worm or the stone, I'm not even sure if they have feelings or thoughts, or it's just dead matter that is stone. So he explains how our ability to know what is around us is by a certain subjective process through perception using external symbols which the mind translates into its own terms subjectively. Now all of this is the basis for our normal life. When we shift consciousness and enter into deeper or higher states, then first of all the mind becomes very quiet. But our perception of the world that the mind created still continues. But from that poise, this perception that mind created now seems to be fake, unreal or unsubstantial. Because mind saw names, forms and created subjectively an idea of what things are. But now when you've shifted to a higher consciousness, its values, it perceives the world on a deeper level. Against that deeper reality, all of this which my mind had constructed now becomes fake, unreal, or fades out into unreality to a degree that now it becomes an illusion even. At that point, what is left for you to form a bridge with reality? Your mind has become quiet. It is no more active. It is no more making an effort. Because that was your way to get to a higher consciousness. And the result is, you have no other bridge left. And the result, the practical result of this, we live in a blissful, infinite impersonality of a pure spiritual existence. Nothing else and nobody else any longer matters to us. What the physical senses show and what the mind perceives and conceives about them, and so imperfectly and transiently delights in, seems now unreal and worthless. And in this way, we find our immersion in the oneness or in God's delight, or if at all there is any sense of connection with the world, we realize that this world of names and forms is such a pale shadow compared to God's delight. And why did God sully himself with something so crude and undivine? Or so it seems. But he explains, if in the approach of our yoga, as a result of the effort to re-engage with the world from that liberated consciousness, we re-enter the relationship of with things from that deeper consciousness, then something else happens. We gaze upon the very same names and forms now which have become blurred, unreal or fake, and now we exercise our deeper perception. We see the person no more as a body with a form in a certain language. We perceive directly the divine presence within them. Just as we live in to out, from our inner poise, we experience the inner truth in each one. And at that point, if we have made a conscious effort to re-engage, from in to out, we recover the layers or levels of reality of experience in each person. We begin to see, just as within me, I have my thoughts and emotions, which are superficial layers around my deeper spiritual core, so too within them, there are those layers. And one begins now to re-engage with the reality of the world, but from a completely changed standpoint. So, we see the real being in them, and we see them as selves of ourself and not mere names and forms. They become realities of the eternal. Our minds are no longer subject to the delusion of trivial unworthiness or the illusion of unreality. The material life loses indeed for us its old absorbing value, but finds greater value which it has for the divine Purusha. So now the change which has happened, while the old way by which our mind used to value things is now gone, we begin to value them from the poise of this center of consciousness, the true individual, the divine Purusha, the way it values its world. And in this, he explains how we recognize that the material life is a product of or a derivation of the higher levels of consciousness. And rather than seeing it something as inferior, we recognize that its value is in terms of those higher levels, and to the extent that it can manifest them and express them. Now suddenly the whole perspective changes. There is a complete reversal of priorities. Matter now reacquires an importance, but from in to out valuation. It is the means, the vehicle, the field in which the divine consciousness can act, representing itself, manifesting itself, formulating, putting into form its own higher realities. And then he says, even it becomes now more valuable because of what it can provide, which is not possible on other levels of consciousness. Life then becomes justified to us and no longer stultified by the possession of liberated self-knowledge. Now this is another important change that has to take place. No more we view life as something which is limiting and less valuable than the spirit. There has to be this reversal of valuation in which life becomes as valuable or even the most valuable part of the spirit's action in the cosmos because of what it can offer for the purpose of the spirit's full self-expression and play and delight of the play. So this larger integral knowledge and freedom liberates us in the end and fulfills our whole existence. Nothing is left out anymore. And we see ourselves in these three terms: individual, the divine, and the world. And all three are now deeply interdependent. They form the field in which the full divine play can work out. And we have no longer the experience of our existence as exclusive of the other existences which make up, by our relations with them, our experience of the world. We are no more exclusive. We are a special focus of the one which is taking simultaneously a special focus in every individual, and himself lays out his own consciousness and force to form the backdrop, so to say, the stage on which this play can fulfill itself. And in this, there is the underlying sense of the embrace of everything. The world is embraced. We are Purusha, embracing world, but we are also fulfilling in the individual. We are all the eternal. And the self in each secretly embraces all in itself and seeks in various ways to make that higher truth of its unity apparent and effective in its terrestrial being. So secretly, not overtly, we are not conscious of it in the surface part, but deep within the self is embracing not only the whole world, but each one, because that is the deeper truth of that unity. Also, secretly, we are all assisting each other. We are all working together. Not mutual exclusiveness, but mutual inclusiveness is the divine truth of our individuality. So now in this liberated, divinized individuality, what earlier began as a movement of exclusion to be able to hold my individuality against everyone else, to have a separate world experience, we have now changed to mutual inclusiveness in the true individuality that has come. Love, the higher law, and not an independent self-fulfillment. And if the sense of embracement is the sense of self-giving to all, the most obvious expression of self-giving is love. And in all this, the Purusha, who is our real being, is always the master of Prakriti. We are seeking to arrive at its independence, which is also justified. We have the utility of the egoistic movement as a temporary passage, as a step to form that individual focus. But now, through this poise of liberation, that is no more necessary. It is to be discarded. And there is also transcendence of nature as well as possession of nature. Fulfillment of individuality and fulfillment of our relations with the world. And this is the grand vision that he brings us to from this changed perspective. Our unity with others would not have any meaning if their liberation was not as much a priority as our liberation. And so here we come to another important insight, that the journey is no more an individual liberation, it is a collective liberation in which We are each responsible for and interested in the liberation of all others, to whatever extent is natural in their path, in their way, and yet we are not separate from their way. And so comes another important idea, that the collective fulfillment of the divine is the goal, not an individual fulfillment. And for this, increasingly, and especially as this turn of the integral yoga becomes more prominent in humanity, the collective fulfillment will begin to become much more valued than an individual liberation and divinization. And one of the turns we see in humanity today is the need to form collectives in which the divine can begin to preside over life, and an overall divinization of the collective can take place. Sri Aurobindo concludes with 3 traps that we have to get free from. The first was the lure of egoistic existence in the world. We started with, I want to satisfy myself, and that was the trap which we got free from in the first step. And often it is with most of the religious traditions that they teach you, get out of your pettiness and your ego, go to a higher poise of consciousness. But then the second allure, the second trap, is the lure of individual happiness in heavens beyond. We have to get free of that, because it is not individual anymore in this larger vision. And then the third, he says, to conquer the highest lure of escape from life and a self-absorbed bliss in the impersonal infinity is the last and greatest victory. That was the immersion which was offered as the highest goal by most of the traditions. That itself now has to be transcended, and we re-embrace the world and all individual lives, and are equally responsible for all as for ourselves. It is interesting that in the Buddhist tradition, this idea comes up very strongly, not obvious in the early stage when the Buddha himself taught, but later on, as the Buddhist experience developed to its own higher possibilities, the highest poise in which the Buddha is venerated is the poise of the Amitabha Buddha, where on the brink of his transcendence and immersion into nirvana, he pauses, and in a gaze of great compassion turns upon the world and decides not to immerse himself into nirvana until every single being is liberated. Sri Aurobindo points to this turning and re-embracing of the world as the poise where the individual becomes the avatara. Because on the brink of immersion, there is nothing left of his individual ego limitation, and from there, identified with the divine consciousness, when he turns to re-embrace, he is no more separate, he is the divine turning to embrace the world and becomes the avatara. So there are 2 kinds of avatara. There is the avatara which is the divine projecting himself into the world as an individual, incarnating in the individual body. But there is the other kind of avatara which is an evolving human being who reaches complete identification with the divine and then turns, still incarnate in body, re-engaging with the world. And it is that which is considered the highest poise of the Buddha. So every tradition, whatever may have been its immediate priority, as it develops to its higher possibilities, eventually aligns itself to something of this perspective, even as its philosophical formulation remains as it was in an earlier stage, but the vision that it has somehow must bring back this sense of non-exclusiveness of the individual, then are we rid of all individual exclusiveness and possessed of our entire spiritual freedom. This is where we had stopped last. So we have done a quick sweep of this grand vision, but we must dwell upon this. Consciously cultivate this way of looking at the world. We are not separate individual souls, we are the same one divine Purusha, experiencing itself in so many different ways and experiencing its journey of awakening in so many different ways. But we are each other, and our individual liberation is deeply intertwined with the liberation of others, in order that we may experience collectively the liberated nature and divinization of life. He uses this very interesting phrase, our own divine self-interest is in the liberation of others. Our own divine self-interest. So we continue now to the last paragraph of the chapter, where he describes what does such a liberated being experience. What does he live by? What is his relation with the world and other beings and the divine? So, the state of the liberated soul is that of the Purusha who is forever free. Same poise as the divine consciousness. All nature pours out of him. He transcends nature, and yet he is fully engaged, manifesting through nature. Its consciousness, the Purusha, the liberated soul, its consciousness is a transcendence and an all-comprehending unity. It does not separate. Our idea of transcendence is standing back beyond but abandoning. But the true transcendence is when you are free and are including all in your freedom. So all-comprehending unity. Comprehending as in embracing in itself and experiencing it all as a part of itself. But all not as pieces, but as itself, and therefore the underlying oneness of all is its primary experience. Its self-knowledge does not get rid of all the terms of self-knowledge, but unifies and harmonizes all things in God and in the divine nature. So when it knows itself, it can know itself in so many different ways, but each of these are aspects of its own self-knowing. And so there is the harmonization of everything in the oneness of the consciousness, as well as in the multiple play of the nature, and so divine nature. He's bringing many different angles now, which might have been passages to this poise. So the path of the ecstatic union with the divine and others he touches upon and shows how there are aspects which may lead to this and in how they relate. The intense religious ecstasy, which knows only God and ourselves and shuts out all else, is only to it an intimate experience which prepares it for sharing in the embrace of the divine love and delight around all creatures. So in the path of bhakti, there is this very highly valued experience where you are so immersed with the divine that there is only you and the divine. The whole world fades away. No other individual is present in it. It is the most intimate union that you can have from an individual poise with the divine. It is the poise in which we will meet the divine even in the path of knowledge as we enter deep within in our consciousness and unite with our source. There is only you and the divine into which you are merging. There is no world, there are no other individuals. And so all of these are approaches. So he says, an intimate experience which prepares it for what? For sharing in the embrace of the divine love and delight around all creatures. Having acquired this, living in it, when you re-engage with the world and meet all individuals as yourself, with whom do you experience the love? In each one you see the same divine. Each is yourself and you experience the same embrace. So love, divine love pours out in the embrace, and the delight of the multiplicity is now expressed in the play. A heavenly bliss which unites God and ourselves and the blessed, but enables us to look with a remote indifference on the unblessed and their sufferings, is not possible to the perfect soul. So this is another position which you see in religious traditions, that the goal is to unite with God or live in the heavenly bliss. But then there are those who are not blessed by God. There are those who have fallen, those who have gone astray, or who have not followed the law by which they would come into this heavenly poise. And you look at them with a remote indifference. Oh yes, they got what they deserved. And that poise, he says, is not possible. So first he's showing you what is the way, but very clearly what is not the way is also to be recognized. Is not possible to the perfect soul, for these also are its selves. If you are in this immersion, those who are unblessed, who don't share in it, are yourself. And so you cannot look upon them with a remote indifference. Free individually from suffering and ignorance, it must naturally turn to draw them also towards its freedom. So its relationship with all beings is to assist in their awakening to the same freedom that it has. So now if you bring this perspective, what is the role of this liberated soul? Well, everything he does is to assist in that awakening of freedom. Now if you think about this deeply, it does not matter what is the external form of life which you engage with. Whatever the form and activity that you are participating in, for you that form and that activity is only a means for assisting this awakening and liberation. We'll come back to this idea later. But if you make this now the full focus, I am here now to free everybody, then there comes another distortion possible. On the other hand, any absorption in the relations between self and others and the world to the exclusion of God and the beyond is still more impossible. You cannot get stuck into this one focus of world and awakening or liberating the world, excluding from that. Why is it more impossible? Because that is your poise of liberated consciousness. So you cannot really cut that out. And therefore, it cannot be limited by the earth or even by the highest and most altruistic relation of man with man. So while you may engage with the world, all those relationships of engagement, of trying to help, etc., they don't bind you anymore. You're not here to help. You're not here to do good. All those value systems which were part of the ego's engagement with others in a larger awakening are all gone. So this is very important to recognize, because the liberated man is not driven to be helping and being altruistic. And yet that is the only thing he does. Not altruistic, I mean, assisting in the awakening. Its activity or its culmination is not to efface and utterly deny itself for the sake of others, but to fulfill itself in God's possession, freedom, and divine bliss, that in and by its fulfillment, others too may be fulfilled. So now he has to describe this at a level which is very essential. So we'll dwell on the words and the idea for a while. You see, the picture we have of a saint is somebody who is busy trying to do good. And every now and then you have the stories of saints who are abused by the bad ones, and the saint quietly suffers, does not get angry, does not fight back, is non-violent, and through his suffering somehow the bad fellow is now breaks down with his guilt and says, "Oh, you are so great, now I will follow you." That's the kind of story you will find everywhere. And so the idea of self-effacement and denying of ourselves for the sake of others is the moralistic picture of the saintly or divinely awakened person. And he says this is not it either. It's activity or its culmination. You see, there are two different poises. You can say the activity is different, but when challenged, the culmination of your activity should be self-effacement or self-denial. No, that's not it either. For the sake of others. What does he do? Because remember, the whole true individuality is centering itself in the divine Purusha. To fulfill itself in God, possession, freedom, and divine bliss. What are you here for? What is the line of your individual development, growth and fulfillment, as each one has their own line of individual growth and fulfillment? So you fulfill yourself first in God possession. You possess the divine consciousness as your base, as your foundation, as the source of all your thoughts, feelings and actions. But it is no more something which you are struggling to acquire. You are seated in it, possessed of it. Not only you are in God consciousness, but in the freedom which comes with it. Bound to nothing, dependent on nothing. And therefore, even conventional laws and forms are irrelevant. And seated also and expressing of the divine bliss in everything you do. And it does not matter what you do. Because of the poise of the consciousness, all is, to your perception, a play of the divine bliss, and in your expression, an expression of the divine freedom and bliss. What are you doing? Someone could be an artist, another could be a scientist, another could be a warrior, another could be a servant of the people, and maybe working for social good. But that's not the point of it. That's just the vehicle of it. In it, it is always an expression of that. To fulfill itself in God, possession, freedom and divine bliss, that in and by its fulfillment, others too may be fulfilled. By fulfilling this, in the fulfillment, others are fulfilled. By this fulfillment, others are fulfilled as a result of what you do. Now, we have examples which you find in literature sometimes, that here's this person doing exactly what they were doing, and people come and somehow they are moved or inspired or somehow changed by that contact, and maybe they move on. But the person did nothing in terms of preaching or showing or demonstrating anything, unless of course that was their line of fulfillment. I have an example here in a more social context, but still it is the example itself relies on the spiritual awakening of the person. There is the example here of Dr. V, who was the founder of Aravind Eye Hospital. If you have ever heard about him, if you have not heard about him, it is worth reading. He was a man who had lost control of his hands because of a nerve degenerative disease. Not only he was able to overcome by an action of the inner consciousness and will, he was able to overcome the nerve degeneration. He reacquired full control of his hands and dedicated his life in service as a doctor to the only thing he knew, well, treating eyes, giving sight through eye surgery. Organized a whole framework, a system by which he would do numerous surgeries in a kind of a mechanical structure of an assembly line process. So they would have literally 100 patients lined up in the bed. The nurses would prepare them and he would go one surgery after the next in a single day, doing several hundred sometimes. And just by the fact of what he was, not even what he did, what he was, people began to cluster around him. An entire hospital developed, an entire team of doctors, nurses developed, each one sharing in that same kind of commitment. So there was a Harvard study which was done over his model of business, because everything he did was free. All surgeries were free. You were free, of course, to donate also. And overall, the whole thing made more money than it needed, which was plowed back into expanding the facilities. And he developed the most advanced eye care facility in India, perhaps one of the best in the world, in the hospital which grew around him. And he was asked, one of the things he was asked was, how do you inspire people? What do you do? Because nobody saw him preaching, nobody saw him giving pep talks. There was no morning prayer where he'll sit with them, or nowhere where he shared his ideal or his sense of purpose. And so they asked, what do you do? How do you inspire people? He said, I have lunch with them. He ate with them. So while eating, he was sitting with them, and that was all. What did he really do? Nobody can see anything happening. But just the fact that what he lived had this power of consciousness, it spread. It was a kind of a positive infection. And spread by infection, those values, that change, the turn of the consciousness, in whatever way it was. And obviously people more aligned to that line of turn, that form of expression, were drawn to him and formed around him. You never saw him raise his voice, you never saw him scold anybody. It was all so spontaneously and easily done. The only hint of his spiritual life was that he named his hospital Aravinda Eye Hospital after Sri Aurobindo, and later he asked for Sri Aurobindo's relics to be installed there. Other than that, you saw nothing of his spiritual life. And it's a good example of how much one can impact one's environment and awaken others without needing any form of external teaching, preaching, or show of example. He just did his thing, and then the rest formed around it. So in the formulation which Sri Aurobindo gives, he goes to the essence of it. It's not what you do. To fulfill itself in God possession, freedom and divine bliss. That in its fulfillment, others too may be fulfilled. By its fulfillment, others too may be fulfilled. That's it. By fulfilling yourself, others also are fulfilled. And it happens. In the process of fulfilling yourself, it may take the form, oh, so-and-so is a preacher, oh, so-and-so is a doer, oh, so-and-so is inspiring because of some form of what he does. But the fellow could have just been sitting alone and would have been just an artist painting or carving, meeting nobody perhaps, and just by fulfilling that, he might be impacting others. Maybe his art barely survives. And you see this in examples of some of the great artists who revolutionized the field of art. They were also semi-vibhutis in many cases. We see often their lives ending in poverty, and the art they created was so far ahead of its time, and then after a decade or two, suddenly people realized the value of their art. And many of the great artists, Van Gogh being one such example, I think, or any other form. There have been equally people who have impacted the world and no one even knows their name. But just the fact that they did what they did, they were what they were, was enough to make that impact. And we will never know their names. But if you feel in the universal consciousness, you will know, yes, there was such a person. Otherwise, this imprint would not exist in the universe. So I reread the whole sentence. Its activity, the activity of the liberated soul, its activity or its culmination is not to efface and utterly deny itself for the sake of others, but to fulfill itself in God possession, freedom, and divine bliss. That in and by its fulfillment, others too may be fulfilled. For it is in God alone, by the possession of the divine only, that all the discords of life can be resolved. And therefore the raising of men towards the divine is in the end the one effective way of helping humanity. If you really want to help humanity, the one effective way, he doesn't say the only effective way. You can help in many ways. But the one effective way, because it is in the underlying impact the most impactful, the one effective way is by possession of the divine and in the divine, that all discords of life can be resolved, and therefore the raising of men towards the divine is in the end the one effective way of helping mankind. The raising of men towards the divine. But he says in the end. In the beginning you will start in many ways. But all those ways ultimately rely upon this. That's the idea. You may not be doing this directly. You may be doing this indirectly. You may be going around in social service distributing food to those who are unable to, maybe for various reasons of illness, to prepare their food. You may be distributing clothes in a situation of natural disaster. But if there has not been the raising of men towards the divine, all of that will fail. I'm reminded of a dramatic example which was from the former students of the ashram school. When there was a tsunami here about 15 years ago, and the shock wave, the ocean came into the beach and destroyed many of the houses on the beach, especially the fishermen whose houses were relatively close. And 2 weeks down, a group of our students had gathered money from donations. They had bought kits of clothing and food. 2 weeks down after the whole disaster, they go into the villages and went into each one's houses to distribute these packets. That was their way of doing good, helping society, whatever their idea. And they were in a state of shock. They found the filth inside the house, the filth which the ocean had brought in, was still littered in the house. The people living in the houses were sitting there playing cards, smoking or drinking alcohol. They had not bothered to sweep their house clean. And they were just waiting for all the freeloading money and the food or packets of clothing or other goodies that were being given to them. And to get those goodies, they had to keep the dirt. Here's my disaster, please give me more money. Isn't it? If I clean it up and I'm now independent, people come and say, you don't need my help. And some of them were so shocked, they couldn't contain it. They shouted at those people saying, don't you have the decency to clean your own house? Then it was a bit of a shock. What happened? What went wrong? All efforts were to meet the immediate requirement of the disaster. Here, give food, palliatives. There was no effort in awakening, changing consciousness, lifting it a step higher. And you will see everywhere in the world where people have gone with altruistic effort, without the change of consciousness, they have actually created greater disaster. A practical example is in Africa, where I don't remember which, it was perhaps on the east coast, one of the countries, where there was a big famine. So all the countries which had their excess food dumped their excess food. It's a convenient way of getting positive points in the media. So they dumped a lot of food. All the food went there. For a while, people had what they needed. It was free. Next year, there was a bigger famine, and the years after, a series of big famines. Unlike the first famine, which was a natural disaster because of lack of rain, the subsequent famines were because human beings had stopped planting crops. Because if you planted crops and worked for it, you could not get the price of free. right? You would not get money when free food was coming in from everywhere, and nobody wanted to work anymore because it was coming free. And the series of disasters which followed later, nobody was there to help because it was not a natural disaster. Another example which was narrated to me when I first went to Orissa, somebody who was there in the government at a senior level, they were working so hard to train the farmers in the most extreme poor regions, to train them to have 2 crops in a year. Because 1 crop was just enough for them to take care of their needs. If they planted 2 crops, then they could have more and excess, and their quality of life could improve. So they taught them to plant 2 crops. The farmers were very grateful, thanked them intensely, gave them in whatever way they could, they showed their appreciation. And then a year down, when they visited to see how well the farmers were doing, they found them sitting idle, not planting the 2nd crop. That was all. Because, well, inertia. What else do you explain? Any other explanation is only a cover for this. Inertia. And it was so frustrating, he said, because we tried so hard to train, there was no way to get free from that inertia. As long as they had what they needed, they could not think ahead for a little more. And that inertia has only one cure, the awakening of desire. And that's what the commercializing influences have brought in from the market. To awaken desire, bring in a rajasic tendency which will counter the tamas, and so on. Go through a cycle of frustration, of craving and chasing after desires, not being able to fulfill them, in order to overcome the inertia. Before a higher step of consciousness can come of a sattvic nature, clarifying and purifying the confusion of the desire-driven life, and so on. But when you look at that, you see the problem was not training. The problem was not lack from giving or support. It was an underlying problem of consciousness. And if you do not address that, whatever you may do to intervene, in fact, the more you do to intervene, the more problems you may create, which may be more difficult to solve eventually. So the point he gets to here is, therefore the raising of men towards the divine is in the end the one effective way. In the end there are no 2 effective ways, there is only one effective way. In the beginning there are a million ways, but all those ways eventually rely in the end upon this one thing, which is raising of men towards the divine. Now, this raising of men towards the divine is a very generic form. It can take many it's a generic formulation. It can take many different forms. And as I said earlier, even the drive of desire to awaken, to want more, is a step in that direction, out of inertia, out of darkness, towards some confused light, but still a step towards light. Now, if you look at the world situation today, if you look at pockets of humanity with their particular problems and conflicts, and now begin to see from this perspective, what is it that the conflict represents? What is the block in terms of growth of consciousness that this conflict is the result of? Then we will understand how to set it right by intervening at the level of consciousness change in the next step of raising towards the divine. But otherwise, the conflict is a symptom of something blocked, preventing from the raising to the divine. Bring back that movement of raising to the divine, and everything else will now unfold and settle into perhaps lesser conflict, greater harmony, or a passage through a greater partial harmony through another form of conflict to a greater partial harmony, until eventually the harmony rises sufficiently that conflict is no more the means for growth. As long as we need the goad of pain and struggle to grow, it will come one way or other. Once we outgrow that need and are now in a conscious movement of self-development, it's no more necessary, conflict will pass. Or in that higher movement, if you get stuck somewhere and are unable to break free of the sticky point, then the goad of pain will come to squeeze and push you to break free again. So, raising of men towards the divine is in the end the one effective way of helping mankind. Now this could be done by many ways, as we saw. Externally, by so many ways. Education would be one thing. Bringing back a system of governance, of justice, of well-being, good health, all of these, good nutrition, all of these may be valuable as long as they assist in this awakening. But there will have to be at some point a more direct part of the awareness of why we are here, of the sense of purpose, of the higher goal of our life. It does not need to use the word God or divine. It can just be for beauty, for truth, for well-being, but on a higher level of consciousness. Some sense of growth of consciousness must come in as the only effective way, as the one effective way of helping mankind. So, rereading the full sentence. For it is in God alone, by the possession of the divine only, that all the discords of life can be resolved. This is the fundamental principle. Any discord can be resolved only if you go back to the source in which the conflicting forces are seen as complementary forces. As long as you are in a consciousness where there are still conflicting forces, you cannot avoid discord. And so each challenge, each problem of life, each conflict forces you to rise one step above to a level where the two are now seen as complementary. So in your normal life, little problems come up requiring little steps in which the conflicts are resolved. But if you look at the big picture, the big problems can only be resolved at a greater height. So little pushes help you to grow towards the greater height. Meanwhile, the big problems continue until you reach that greater height where now they are seen to be complementary and are resolved. So if you look at the big picture of all the problems of the world, you see this very interesting hierarchy. Little problems at each level nudging you to the next small level. Big problems compelling you to make great leaps of levels. And it's all there. The picture you will find resonates with the game which we used to play as children, Snakes and Ladders, maybe it's named differently, where you throw the die and each time you get a number between 1 and 6 and you take so many steps. And if you touch a ladder, then you shoot straight up. If you touch the mouth of a snake, then you fall straight back. And in this picture, you see the nature of life. Every step, every effort that you make is like throwing the die. It's a gamble. You don't really know because you're operating from ignorance. You don't really know if your step is the right step. Maybe it's half right, maybe it's half wrong. But every time you throw the die, something pops up. If you're lucky, it's 6. If you're unlucky, it's 1. But it looks like 6 is lucky because you moved forward, but you hit the mouth of the snake and you fell back. So the value of your luck also is not in appearances, but in terms of consciousness. I won the lottery, I'm a rich man, but I fell in consciousness because I suddenly lost control over my own desires. It was my poverty which retained me within limits of not being overwhelmed by my desire until I outgrew the desire impulse enough now to be able to handle more wealth. And we don't understand this. You just hit with your 6 the mouth of the snake and you fell back. So you don't really know even the value of what you have got. And the one perhaps is what takes you to the ladder that takes you the highest. And so a little step where life beat you down was the one where you learned humility and gave you the breakthrough that was needed for your leap of consciousness. So if you look at the nature of the game, You discover in it something so profound of the symbol of life. And that's why as children, it resonates deeply within us. And something of this image comes when you read these lines and you look at this picture of the world and the relationship of problems with the growth of consciousness. It is in God alone and by the possession of the divine only that all the discords of life can be resolved, the big and the small. And therefore, this is the logical outcome, therefore the raising of men towards the divine is in the end the one effective way of helping mankind. And obviously that's what the liberated soul will do. All the other activities and realizations of our self-experience have their use and power. But in the end, these crowded side tracks or these lonely paths must circle around to converge into the wideness of the integral way by which the liberated soul transcends all, embraces all, and becomes the promise and the power of the fulfillment of all in their manifested being of the divine. The chapter ends here. And as with every chapter, the end line is a powerful punch, gives you something so grand that you need to dwell upon it to fully appreciate. So we'll look at first three aspects of the whole sentence. First, he is describing the place of all other activities and realizations of our self-experience. They all have their use and their power. So the activities we do and the realizations of our self-experience are two different things. So as an activity, I'm going around doing this, by which I'm helping others. Great. My self-realization is that shift in consciousness by which I'm helping others, but it's not seen as an activity necessarily. And self-realizations, because a series of small realizations by which we grow. Now you'll notice in life, a series of self-realizations awakening me eventually brings me to that recognition, you know what, this activity which I have done for so long, I don't find it fulfilling anymore. I feel now with the new person that I am, something else is more useful. You see the relationship between the two, but they are different. It's not obvious how they are connected. You do something very simple, but you grow inwardly, and the growth may have nothing to do with the particular form of it. I can be a doctor serving patients, or I can be an artist making beautiful paintings, or I can be a farmer working with my land. The inner growth will come in spite of whatever the form of external life is. But when that grows sufficiently, it will ripple out in the form of my activity. So, all other activities and realizations of our self-experience have their use and power. Now these realizations of self-experience are not the highest realizations he is referring to, but I suddenly discovered that I find greater joy in being like this than in being like that. I discover that within me there is some part that enjoys being alone, and so far I never knew that. Or I suddenly discover, and they're all self-discoveries, tiny steps within our growth. They all have their use and power, but they're crowded side tracks in most cases. If you go today in the space of non-government organizations, NGOs, trying to do good for the poor, for example, it's a very crowded space. There are literally thousands or hundreds of thousands of registered NGOs doing exactly the same thing, looking for funds. In fact, it's become such a big business that it's the most convenient thing to do if you want to raise funds. And how do you raise funds? The most sympathy you will get is, I'm starting an orphanage for orphans. And that pulls at heartstrings of people who donate. And it's become such a convenient big business that you realize that there are not enough orphans out there. So if you go to a typical orphanage now in India, you'll find very few are actual orphans. Most of them are people children that parents have put there because they'll have a good life and they'll be looked after, they'll get free education and clothing, etc. And many orphans which I have seen, the actual number of orphans is less than 1/10 of the full number. But it's a crowded space. There are also lonely paths. There are very few people who are willing to break out of these crowded spaces and really go and do something exceptional. I'll give another example because it gives you an example of what the spiritual influence can be like, and even including the form of self-denial. This is a young girl, and maybe I mentioned it before, but it's worth mentioning again. It's a young girl in Bombay. She grew up with all the benefits, and every day coming home she would find just outside their house a poor family, little children who did not have all that she had. They barely lived hand to mouth. They didn't have an education. They didn't have the toys that she had. So when she completed her education, she had the highest marks, highest performances. She said, I'm not even going to take my certificate. I won't look at my marks. I want to experience what it's like not to have anything. And she looked all over the map of India and said, here in Rajasthan, in the desert, where there's no water, no electricity, no food can grow, that's what it's like to be fully deprived. And she went there, found a village far away from any of these. In the village, people had to walk many kilometers every day just to bring food, just to bring water. The children had to walk many kilometers to go to the nearest government school. And so, in the hot sun, she lived with them, lived like them, with no other trappings, with their same clothes, with their own same food. She walked with the children to go to school. And going to the school, it was a very oppressive atmosphere. The girls were asked to sit outside because it was a small room. The boys were going to be sitting inside because after all the girls will get married. What's the point of educating them? The boys are the ones who will run the family business, so they need to get educated. And the girls would sit in the hot sun. There was no shade. And the principal of the school was a drunk. He would sit in his room and be inebriated. So this girl has gone every day walking for 10, 20 kilometers. And then she sits outside with the other girls, and then she goes and asks to meet the principal. He says, sorry, today I'm busy, you come tomorrow. So she sits at his gate every day. After 20 days, he asks her, you won't give up, will you? And she says, no. The result was, he finally invited her in. She spoke what she had to say, and bit by bit brought about a change. Now, if you see a normal person going in there and ordering the principal would have been thrown out. She broke his resistance, met him on his level, and then began a process of change, at the end of which this drunkard gave up his alcohol, became a focal point for a complete rebuilding of the educational system, and today runs 140 schools. One person entering with full determination, with the power and the strength of being which comes from a spiritual source. You cannot do this from a purely altruistic or moral poise. But bringing something of that into the life is able to bring about a radical change like this. And in the process, the person grows, everybody around them also undergoes a change, and the whole space has shifted levels. So this is not this crowded side tracks, this was a lonely path. If you tell a young person from a privileged society with all the comforts and benefits of the wealthy city, leave all this and go into the most extreme opposite condition and go through the struggle and change things, how many would volunteer? So these are the lonely paths. So we have the crowded side tracks and the lonely paths, but whichever you have chosen, eventually all these paths and tracks have to circle around. You see, the change made at its most surface, did not have any obvious change of consciousness. It was breaking of a certain rigidity and limitation. But because inside was a change of consciousness, that had massive ripple effects. Subsequently, the same girl went to the village meetings of the elders. And in the village meeting, the panchayat, the men will sit on chairs, the women have to sit on the ground. If they have to speak, only and with the acceptance of the men. This is in very patriarchal part of Rajasthan. So they have to stand and they won't be given a chair. And so she had gone to help them as part of another project, and there she said, I'm sorry, I will stand but I will not sit. And so she would stand 6 hours at a time in the hot sun. Eventually she said, either you give me a chair or I will stand but I will not sit. Eventually they gave her a chair. And the result was the whole balance of gender changed. After that, all the women heads in the decision making had equally the same chairs and so on. But it's not an easy path. This was a very difficult path chosen. Eventually, though, it was successful because it could bring about a change of consciousness. So his point here is, in the end, these crowded side tracks or these lonely paths must circle around to converge. Not converge to a point, converge to the wideness of the integral way. You see, it's not a single point into a narrow thing you have to do. The integral way allows for change of consciousness in every way possible, each in their unique way. But all these should converge into the integral way, eventually, by which the liberated soul transcends all, embraces all, and becomes the promise and the power of fulfillment of all. So, the integral way leads to what? The liberated soul. And the liberated soul has 3 things in his relation with the cosmos. First, transcends all. Otherwise you're not liberated. Because you transcend all, you're bound to nothing. You're able to do everything. This is the first poise. Second, embraces all. Because you're bound to nothing and can do everything, you're able to embrace and accept everything. Now, within the embracement of everything, you may still act within a limitation which is your particular line of work or that which is inspired by the divine within you. But you have embraced all. Nothing is left out. Everything is included. And the third outcome of this is becomes the promise and the power of the fulfillment of all. And this is something which is exceptional. We have to look at a little more deeply. Becomes the promise of the fulfillment of all. If one person can reach this, then it's the promise that everybody else can reach this. Sri Aurobindo has some pretty dramatic statements when he says something like, numbers don't matter for the spiritual change. For the change or liberation of the world, numbers don't matter. It's counterintuitive because you will see every spiritual or religious movements which wants to change the world are aiming at numbers. And many of the organized religions even include this in their mechanism of multiplication, that one day when everybody is following our one religion, true religion, then the world will be at peace and everything will be fine. So that's kind of built into the propagation required. Sri Aurobindo says, no, numbers don't matter. For real change, for religion it's different. When there is one person who is able to change consciousness, it has a ripple effect impacting all in this way. Now, in the examples which I have given of a few people who were able to impact in their local space, you can see it was not from a very high spiritual realization. But when your spiritual realization is very high, your local space is the universe. And therefore the impact you have is upon the whole universe. There is an aphorism of Sri Aurobindo where he puts it in this way, and I summarize, that a yogi in the Himalayas dreamt of liberty, equality and fraternity. And that created as a ripple effect the whole French Revolution. that power of the thought of his dream, now it's not a mental dream, it was obviously in a higher state of consciousness, dwelling on this triple ideal, which released that ripple effect. It rippled all over the world, all over the earth. Everyone was touched on some level. But it caught on in a part of the world which was most ready to receive these ideals, and so seized the minds of the people who were most ready and created a revolution. And a revolution which, if you observe carefully, has defined the ideals for all of humanity subsequently. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Unfortunately, the fraternity aspect is the least of the two. Liberty first, and then equality. And Sri Aurobindo says the French Revolution itself would have been far more successful if they had formulated the ideal in the opposite direction. Fraternity first, and then as a result, liberty and equality. Then the change would not have been merely social and political, but would have been more fundamental. But you can see the rippling out of that ideal on the world, and in external circumstances people will say, because of the French Revolution this ideal got established in humanity. Not quite, if you look deeply. It was because this ideal rippled out from one person upon the whole world, seized upon this particular pocket of the world for a strong revolutionary activity, but impacted all at the same time, that people looked to the French Revolution as an example and said, oh yeah, what about us? We too can do that. But the ideal itself was embedded or influenced by this one mind, one consciousness dwelling upon it. So when the liberated soul transcends all, embraces all, he also becomes the promise of the fulfillment of all. Because he is able to do it, there is this promise that everybody else can do it. But not only is the promise, but the power of the fulfillment of all. So you've shown by example it's possible, but the fact that you embody it has a ripple effect of the power of the realization, which then impacts all. Sri Aurobindo observes how the impact of the Buddha's realization is still felt today. It is so powerful because it was a realization of the consciousness of transcendence turning to the world. But the impact of that has the full power of the transcendence, and its imprint is still felt. And it's not difficult to feel it if you tune into that. One person can have an impact of power. So first is promise that you do it, but that others can now do. But the power itself is impacting others that they are compelled to do, whether consciously or unconsciously. If consciously, then more easily. If attuned to the source, then of course you receive the influence of that power more intensely. So, becomes the promise and the power of the fulfillment of all in their manifested being of the divine. And so this we come to the last important idea. Each one of us is the divine in an individual line or form of manifested being. Each in their manifested being of the divine receives this power and the promise of the fulfillment. But each in their own way, in their own line, in their particular journey, uniquely, distinctly. Although the source is rippling out, it does not make everybody else like it. It empowers each one to be liberated and grow in their own unique way. And this is the beauty of it. Our concept of the spiritual awakening and the collective level is of a monotone, and that's an error. The divine manifests in multiplicity, in which nothing is ever repeated. Each is unique, and each in its own unique way articulates something which nowhere else is expressed. And therefore, in the divine collective awakening, each plays a unique role which nourishes all others. And the whole collective draws from each one as something so precious. So we reread the full sentence now and you will see what is captured, because you've seen now the multiple layers. Let it coalesce into a single vision. All the other activities and realizations of our self-experience have their use and power. But in the end, these crowded tracks or these lonely paths must circle around to converge into the wideness of the integral way, by which the liberated soul transcends all, embraces all, and becomes the promise and the power of the fulfillment of all in their manifested being of the divine. And so with this, he completes the chapter. The chapter is titled The Soul and Its Liberation, and we have seen here particularly that aspect of the role of the individual and what that individual liberation means and what a powerful role it can play in the whole awakening of the cosmos and the divine life. After this, Sri Aurobindo comes back to the larger discussion, which was briefly paused, and we reconnect with the place of the soul and its relationship with nature in the larger play and in the awakening. And what happens in the next paragraph is, it's titled The Planes of Our Existence. Sri Aurobindo describes the various relationships that our consciousness has with our nature and all the levels of consciousness that they form. You will recall in the portion which we summarized and read today, repeatedly there was this idea that the soul freely chooses a particular relationship with nature, with other individual souls, and for its own fulfillment, a certain line of growth of delight. It chooses freely. But it can choose many relationships. It can choose a relationship of isolation. It can choose a relationship of engagement. It can choose a relationship of subjugation where it is now dependent on nature. Or it can choose a relationship of freedom and mastery, or anything in between. And each of these relationships sets a different experience of the world. If it chooses a relationship where the whole focus is on form, form comes first, consciousness is even hidden inside form, then you experience the world as formed of things. You experience a world and universe of things. This is how we experience the material world. If it sets up a relationship with the world of energies, not forms, but the things which pull and push the forms, the things which animate the forms, which give to them life, which even burst out in a form and then shed the form and the energy moves into another form, then now you have a different relationship and a different experience of the universe, of an ocean of energy and life force and all the qualities and powers of life energy. And this is what the soul experiences as the vital world. And so on. He describes the gradations of consciousness which are experienced by the soul as it relates to the universe. And all of this now will be seen in the underlying context of the oneness that we spoke of. Living in a consciousness of oneness as the soul re-embraces the world, these are all the gradations of engagement and the kinds of relationship that it has, which makes for the experience of multiple levels of consciousness and even worlds of consciousness. So just as in the physical world, we have form which are dominant, in the vital world energy is dominant, but you still have beings. But beings where the quality of energy is their characteristic, form is secondary, form is even fluid. Or you have worlds of mind where idea is the dominant theme and energy and form are secondary. But in each of these levels, you have entire worlds, multiple worlds in fact, which you can experience and explore, some of them extremely beautiful because form being not rigid as in the physical world, in the vital domain, everything has power of energy. So the same flower in the vital world will be extremely beautiful. Its perfume extremely moving and intense and even overwhelming. and attractive. And everything, even colors, become brighter, more intense, more beautiful, and so on, as you play with the different levels of worlds and the free play of their characteristics. How do all these worlds relate to the physical world? And above all, the spiritual domain from which all these emerge, how do they all relate? And how does the soul in the physical body, in the material life, relate to those worlds? That will be the exploration of the next chapter, which is fascinating also and very practical, with a lot of occult insights of the domains of consciousness. So we'll pause here, and with a grand vision that he places before us, we have to work to dwell upon this and make this consciously our way of experiencing and looking at the world. Even if from the limited view that our mind offers, it's a deeper and higher part of our consciousness which comes forward when we cultivate this worldview. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions. Yes. We'll start with.
When you tell in the beginning about Avatar, I remember when Shaulindo wrote something to Mother to Shaulindo. And the last sentence, Shaulindo said, when I stay in the earth, when the all of humanity is not coming Avatar.
Yes. I'm glad you brought this up. Sri Aurobindo, when he left his body, it was one of the things which the mother spoke of. He said he will not leave the earth plane. It's not even that he will withdraw into a higher plane. He would remain on the earth plane in the subtle physical domain until this work was completed, continuing to assist from that level. And it was a necessary part of the arrangement that the mother would continue so that they could form the link through which to bring down the supramental power. But that also, as an effort to bring that down into her body singly, would have been of limited value. It had spiritual value in this context because in her consciousness she connected herself to all humanity. And therefore everything which was done in her, everything which was received in her, immediately rippled out and imprinted into humanity. And now if we look back at the examples that we took of how a single person can impact spiritually and eventually physically all of humanity, you see the value of their work from this perspective. Even if Sri Aurobindo had not written a single book, even if around him he had not allowed any disciples to gather, even if he had lived all alone in isolation, unknown to anybody, the work that he did had its impact on the whole world and would ensure the rippling of that outcome, even if nobody knew the name or knew a book or anything. That he wrote this is for humanity a great gift, but it was not necessary for his work. That he accepted disciples around him who could receive more directly not only the teaching but the experience of these things was his direct gift and perhaps a more direct action on the world. But even without this, the work would have been done. We have an exceptional example, but there are many such people who received the imprint of Sri Aurobindo's consciousness and the consciousness that he brought. But one exceptional example is somebody by the name of Teilhard de Chardin from the Christian mystical tradition, who received this concept or this vision of a new step in human evolution and the nature of the change of consciousness that it involved and the new consciousness by which humanity would live and he articulated that within the terms of his tradition. But even in articulating it, he said, these are not my ideas. I received them from someone else. He was conscious of that, and obviously an exceptional mystic. But many others would have received the same ideas and said, I have a brilliant idea, and would have declared it as their own. But it doesn't matter. There were people who copied Sri Aurobindo's writings word to word, entire paragraphs and chapters, and published as their own. And when Sri Aurobindo was informed that so-and-so has done it, he said, that's fine, as long as the idea spread. The authorship is not so important. But the nature of their work was this, precisely. And all this is still in the domain of what we can see. There's something even more profound that they did, which we cannot see, even our mind does not fully understand. And in a large part, it was the work done on the physical body and the physical consciousness and its divinization, its awakening to the divine consciousness and the infusion of the divine force into the body consciousness itself, and as a result, the transformation at a cellular level even. Now, it's one thing to experience a change in the body consciousness. You do a little bit of exercise, you have a boost of energy. You do regularly asanas, your body becomes more conscious, your mind becomes clear as a result. All those benefits are there. But then to enter in the actual organic functioning of the body, introducing a higher consciousness there by which the functioning undergoes a change, that's another step altogether. Then taking it down to the level of the single cells and introducing a higher consciousness there that makes the cells conscious and awakens them to the divine consciousness. That's another level altogether. But still, that's not it. What they brought down was the highest supramental consciousness all the way into the cells. So the mentalizing of the cells is still possible to a degree. At least mentalizing of the organic functions, even with effort we can do. But to bring down the supramental consciousness all the way into the cells, awakening in the cellular consciousness, the awareness of the divine presence, recasting their whole relationship and working on the basis of that consciousness. Only somebody who had access to that and who had a sufficiently awakened body could make that link. And one person doing that in isolation was possible. Sri Aurobindo observed that if they had done this work of transformation in an individual way, it would have been done long ago. But it would have not helped humanity. They had to do it with their full awareness entirely plugged in into the collective consciousness of humanity. And then every change therefore faced the resistance of the whole. And overcoming that whole resistance, making the shift necessary there. And the result has been, there's been a huge change in the collective consciousness of the human being, human species itself. Not just in the mind, which is obvious, not just in the vital, which is still unfolding, but in the physical consciousness itself. Of which the only obvious sign so far is that people are more conscious of their health. They are willing to spend time to exercise, eat healthy, etc. But there is still an unconscious change which is visible but not yet fully articulated, which Mother spoke of in the 1960s when she was asked what will be the first sign of the supramental action in matter. She spoke of two things. First, the weather patterns changing, becoming more temperate. That means the extremes of cold will become warm, the extremes of heat will become cool. We are seeing both happening actually. People are focusing on the warming, but there is also cooling. It's happening at the same time, but it's changed. But the second change, she said, is in the human body. She said the human body will undergo a change, that the form will change, the distinction between the male and female forms will become less, and it will be seen most obviously in those who are cultivating the physical consciousness, as in gymnasts and athletes. And you can see this today if you watch the Olympic Games. When the gymnast is about to move, you cannot make out from the body alone whether it's a man or a woman. But the form is much more androgynous, more close to an ideal. the archetypal form as if more expressed. And it is this which she pointed to as one of the signs of the body. But this is only an external sign of form. I've mentioned before long ago, but I'll repeat. In the ashram we have records, medical records of people who have been in the physical education program now going back 70 years. So from age 5 to 95, every year they used to have a medical checkup with the physical records. And putting all this data on the computer, we found extraordinary information. We find from the 1950s through 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, every decade, the average height of boys and girls is growing up. Interesting. You could say nutrition, but actually we're eating exactly the same food as in the 50s, in the ashram dining room or in the community kitchen for the children. It's pretty much the same food, the same style. In fact, nutritionally food has declined because the rice today has half the nutrition of the rice 30 years ago because of the breeding for speed of growth rather than nutritional content. And yet, average height of boys and girls is growing. But the most interesting, the gap of the two, the average difference between boys and girls is narrowing. As the two grow, the gap between the two is narrowing. Fascinating in this observation that Mother said of the form becoming less different. But that's only form because it's most visible form in matter. It's the change of consciousness which is the most important thing, and that's why I said it's invisible. What has been done is still having its effect, whose change we are beginning to see only in terms of form. So one of the things which we see is there has been an acceleration in the growth of form, in that earlier children would be born with eyes closed, bald head, fists closed, mostly sleeping. Today children are born with eyes open, fully functional fingers, with hair on their head, and they look at you straight. That change, it's as if the stuff which was happening post-birth is being squeezed into the womb, as if an acceleration in the evolution at a physical level. Again, most visible because of form. But the thing not so visible is the growth in consciousness. They are as if more conscious at the time of birth, which they were not so much at earlier times. And the character of awareness at a very young age is higher than it used to be before, and that's why you see children at the age of 2 and 3 utilizing mobile phones and figuring out how it works on their own without being taught a single thing. And something is being done to accelerate at that level. Even that is not yet it, because this is still in the form of mind. At the level of the body, there is a change taking place, which is making it more conscious, more supple, more adaptive. And the result of this is seen only when you look for it and study the cutting edge of this change. And of this, Mother made the observation that 300 years from now, she says, the human body will be enormously more supple than we can imagine. Now try to imagine the human body and how much more supple we could be. Look at the acrobats, that's within your imagination. More than that is what it will be. But not because of the food we are eating, not because of our education, not because of all the other things which have overall declined. Because of this change in consciousness that has been embedded in the human species itself by the action of one person, 2 people, whatever form it takes. But one consciousness embedding, making that change. And so their role is extremely valuable in the evolutionary change which is done. The work is done. The rest is a question of unfolding, and faster or slower, but it will happen because it's already done.
Could I give you an example?
Yes.
Could I give you one example about Mother?
Mm-hmm.
When all the women tell me when you visit Mother, one time maybe in the subtle physical, you see the Mother take hand and suddenly coming very, very, very long.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But in the subtle, but
Yes.
few seconds.
Yes.
But, and
Yes.
physical is
Uh-huh.
stop there, but
Yes.
physical going and take something.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, it is.
at this moment.
True. Thank you. Yes.
So you mentioned that now instead of solo liberation, there's now collective liberation is sort of the trend. So why has this change occurred, and what is the role of singular liberation today?
Yes. So the role of singular liberation is still critical in that the collective changes only by the individual changing. So the unit of change will always be the individual. But the difference is that the individual change is not in isolation. If you look at some of the images 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, each yogi goes into his little cave, right? And then what you do is your business, you are cut off from the world. That was the ideal, the monastic ideal, each one in their little room, effectively a cave. But today, the interest in that kind of a withdrawal from life is gone. You do not see people anymore joining monastic orders. It's over. That age is finished. Every monastic order is in crisis. And yet, people are not running away from religion. They still seek religious or spiritual thing, but in a different, higher spiritual context, which is inclusive of life. No more withdrawing. So to your question, what has made that change? Nothing in the teaching of education, nothing in the religious teaching, nothing in the political sphere, nothing visible has made that change. In fact, it is in spite of efforts of religions to propagate themselves and grip the minds of humans to put it into their little box. In spite of that effort, because they have all the money and all the power, some of them, to spread themselves, in spite of that, the change has taken place in humanity. And that's the result of this inner work of the avatar. By taking up in themselves the collective consciousness of humanity and imprinting this ideal, there has been an awakening in the minds of people and saying, yes, but this is what I want. So Teilhard de Chardin was conscious of what he received because his mind was open and the intuitive part was developed. But otherwise, a normal person will simply get that idea, yes, but I don't want this, I want that. And that's all. But they don't know that the urge, even the ideal, has awakened in them from an influence which came. And that's why the work of the avatar is never seen in his lifetime. You see the result much after. But the work is already done. And the rest is only of working out. Yes.
I'm actually really new to all of this. You mentioned imprinting twice. So, could you just give me a brief idea of what exactly you mean by imprinting?
I use the word imprinting, that's my vocabulary, it's not from the text. In the text, Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, the liberated soul transcends all, embraces all, and becomes the promise and the power of the fulfillment of all. So as an example that one person can do it is the promise that everybody else can do it. But when the person is it, he becomes the power that influences everybody else now to be pulled into that awakened experience. When you walk into a group where, let's say, people are stuck in hopelessness, but you walk in with a hope that is living, not just a mental idea, but a living hope that you live, and you start working with that hope, there is a very rapid infection by which others feel, oh yes, and they get pulled into that awakened hope. So the contagion, a positive contagion of consciousness is taking place because we are all connected on deeper layers. And the deeper you go, the more deeply we are connected. So an action from a deeper layer has a much wider impact than an action from a superficial layer. And the more profoundly seated the source of the action, the more deeply and therefore widely and therefore more lasting is its impact also in the collective. So I use the word imprint because there's also the sense that one does it consciously. So it's as if you, in that part of your consciousness where you feel yourself connected with all, you can will a certain intention. You can awaken a certain idea, and the whole group now begins to feel that, and it becomes a living force in them. Yeah. This is the true sense of leadership. A leader is not somebody who compels a group by fear and reward. That's not the true sense of leadership. The leader is one who spontaneously inspires by this contagion of an ideal, of an energy, of a vision, of a sense of purpose, which changes those who are around him in a way that he carries the group. There is the classic example of Napoleon, who meets the army that has been sent to kill him. He stands before his army and they turn around and join him instead. How does he do that? There's another classic example of Joan of Arc, where she stands before the army which has come to invade her country. She speaks to them of the vision that she sees of their bodies lying dead. And she says, "Go back, save yourself." And the entire army walks away. A woman, never trained in a sword, with a rickety army behind her, she shows them something and they are convinced. You cannot do this by mere talk or mere projection of mental idea. There has to be a greater spiritual power that acts and seizes on the collective's minds and hearts in a way that is so compelling and so vivid and real that there is no other choice. And this is the true nature of leadership, and it is always a spiritual leadership which is the true leadership. All other grades of leadership are useful, they are effective, but only so far. When the spiritual leadership can bring with it the clarity of thought and the power of vital, as well as the perfect action at a physical level, then it is most complete. But it is still the power of the spirit which is, in the end, the most successful and surviving. So we'll begin the next paragraph next Friday. I would suggest rereading, for those of you who are interested, this last paragraph and dwelling on the deeper nuances and implications of this, remaining immersed in this vision, this idea, and even consciously aligning yourself to the source of the idea. Remember, I said one person impacts humanity, but if we consciously align ourselves to that source, to that ideal, to the power of that experience, in order to receive it, it can have an enormous and a rapid effect of change in us, transforming change. So when you read this is Sri Aurobindo's gift. He imprints the experience, you read it with that receptivity, and he imprints the experience, changes your consciousness and awakens you to it in steps, to whatever extent you are able to receive. But there are, as in the examples we have seen, far deeper influences and impacts within us of which we are not conscious, but which also change. You'll find your worldview changing, your mind changing first, but deep within the soul thirsts, and it receives this as a great, deep, satisfying, nourishing influence. And there are deeper imprints of influence and change which eventually will be exposed also in your more surface parts. But reading in this way will be the most effective way by which we can receive the imprint of his experience and the help that he gives as much today as then when he wrote this or worked through the physical body.